Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today. I have a little bit of a cold, so please excuse the scratchy voice. Hopefully, I won't cough in your ear while I'm recording. But okay, so today I'm going to jump right in. So I was thinking about, I'm trying to make sure I cover every aspect that I can think of communication and relationships and things like that. And one of the things I was thinking about leading up to this episode was, the topic of miscommunication. And there are lots of things that happen that cause miscommunication, right? But, so we've talked about when you don't speak clearly or properly, when if your mood is a certain way, then you might be misunderstood if you're yelling or if you're not in the right headspace or it's not the right time. But it's not all miscommunication. A lot of the times happens in much more peaceful situations, and those sometimes can be even more frustrating. Like, obviously, if I'm mad at you and I'm yelling at you, then it's easy to miscommunicate. You're not going to hear me right. I'm not going to speak right. And so that one's a clear miscommunication, and we all understood it was wrong, and then we apologize, we move on. But I think sometimes it's more frustrating when the miscommunication happens in a time where we think we're speaking pretty clearly. So, and I've had conversations with clients about this too, where it's so confusing sometimes to be able to, when you think you're being clear and you're saying what you think or you're saying what you feel, and somehow the person you're talking to completely gets a different understanding, or the message comes across completely differently than your intention. And that is so frustrating, because those sometimes can be situations that start out so calm and so peaceful, but then they end in a confrontation or an argument or a fight. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about. And so I want you to be thinking, as I'm talking, of if you've had situations where you walk away from an argument or a disagreement or a fight and you ask yourself, how did that even happen? Like, I don't understand how we started at one point and then ended up in this huge miscommunication or argument. And that is the reason I want you to think about it, is because I'm curious, for obviously you within yourself, is this something that happens often? And if so, it's something that you should probably think about, is what is the cause? Is it that you are speaking more clearly than you actually are, and you need to maybe figure out what you're doing or saying that isn't really coming out the way you think it is? So in that situation, your significant other is hopefully going to help you understand, like, hey, well, you said it this way and in this tone or whatever. And then you're going to have to kind of have a good conversation, calm dialogue about that to try to understand what really happened. Or is it that the person receiving the information from you is not listening well? And honestly, it's hard to know which one's which. It might be a mix of both. So I kind of want you to just go into situations like that with the expectation that it's going to be a mix of both. Because if you go into it expecting that you're communicating clearly, but your spouse is not listening, right? Well, then now we have this, already there's a conflict, and you're going in ready to argue about it. And vice versa, if you feel like, if it turns out that you're not communicating clearly and your spouse is listening well, you're just not speaking, well, there's already a conflict. So go into this assuming that you and your spouse both have room to grow, and that the way you speak and the way the other person listens and vice versa both need to be worked on if this is something that you run into. And, it's interesting because being in the right place to listen is, sometimes it's super simple, but sometimes it's really complicated. If you're distracted, if you have other things you're doing or thinking about, if you're tired, if you're hungry, if your kids are talking to you, if there's something else, you're just kind of waiting to finish this conversation so you can get back to doing it, there's a possibility that you are not listening very clearly. Whether some people intentionally don't listen, but most of the time it's not intentional. You're just not 100% clicked into whatever the other person is saying. And honestly, I think that's where a lot of miscommunication happens, is that it's just not registering. The other person is not receiving it the way that you would want them to. And so, you as a couple, it's important, if this is something you run into where you find yourselves in a situation where you're telling the other person, or they're telling you, like, we already talked about this, I already told you this, and we even had a full conversation about it, but now you don't remember, or you forgot, or whatever, then maybe you need to sit down and say, hey, maybe we need to have a quick check-in, like, hey, are you focused with me? Are you able to focus and listen to what I'm saying, or do you need to talk later? Like, make sure the other person is engaged and that they are hearing you. Or after you're done saying it, say, hey, let's recap. Are you okay with this? Hey, you said you're good with this. Are you sure you're still on, this is going to work with your schedule? Whatever the situation is, don't expect that the other person, just because you fire off information really fast, don't expect the other person to care as much as you do, or to register it as much as you do. And this is something that I do. Like, if something pops in my head that, like, I need to tell my husband, hey, we've got this and this tomorrow, or hey, next week we have this. It might be something that I'm really engaged in, or I'm looking forward to it, or it's something that's really important to me that to him it may not be very important, or it's not something that he really has to participate in, but he does need to know what's going on. Well, I need to make sure that he heard me and that I communicated it at a time where he's not in the middle of doing something else, or just tired, whatever, just not clicked in. So it takes both. Like, if you're talking to me and I know I'm kind of zoned out or I'm distracted, I need to tell you, hey, I'm sorry, I didn't actually hear what you just told me, or I kind of have a lot on my mind right now. Can you give me a minute? Let me wrap up what I'm doing and then let's talk about this. Or, hey, you told me something earlier and I don't think I caught all of it. Will you tell me again? Like, it's a two-way street. You have to let the other person know if you missed something. And then as the speaker, you have to follow up. And this is where a lot of people will do, like follow up with a text or put it in the calendar and, send it to the other person. You need to have a system that you communicate through. However, all of that to say that sometimes you think you're being super clear and you're not, or it's just sometimes you do everything right and you have all the reminders and things still don't go, they don't get registered by the other person. And so if this is something that you run into, I just want this to be this kind of a flag that pops up for you where you tell yourself, hey, this is actually something that we need to work on in our relationship. Let's sit down and talk about this. Let's talk about the fact that we do have miscommunications about simple things, and then we get frustrated with each other, and that turns into an argument or a fight, or we blame each other for not listening or not being clear. So a lot of people, like everyone, experiences this at some point in any relationship, but especially when you're in a married kind of long-term situation where you do have to communicate about a lot of things, especially when there's kids involved. It's very common. So this, likely if you are in a long-term relationship, then this is something you've experienced. It just depends on if this is something that you experience from time to time or if it's super common. That's up to you to decide if this is an issue that you need to address. And it's interesting because a lot of the times you don't realize the miscommunication has happened until later, until it's time to implement the thing you may have talked about or the plan. And then you realize that there was a gap or a lapse in communication. And that's where the frustration comes up. And so if you know that this is something that people deal with a lot, and you accept that this is a common thing that you deal with, or it's just a thing that happens from time to time, then hopefully that will also give you the patience, or at the very least the self-awareness, to say, if this happens, if we find ourselves in a situation where we have miscommunicated and we can't really explain how it happened, we don't remember, or you remember it differently than I do, then we have a choice. We can sit here and be irritated and argue about who was right and who was wrong, or we can say, hey, it happened, it is what it is, there's no point arguing about it, let's just move on. And then, you may later, when everyone's calmed down, you may have to sit down and say, hey, that was kind of a fail. What do we need to do next time? The next time we have an appointment, How do we make sure we both know about it? Do we need to use a different calendar? Do we need to text each other? Do you need me to call you and remind you? Do you need to put it in your work calendar? Whatever, but that is the most important part here. It's how do you sit down as a couple, as a unit, as partners, and come up with a better plan? Because where a lot of couples stop is they have the fight or the argument about the miscommunication, and they get irritated, and then eventually they calm down, they move on, and that's it. That's kind of where I would consider that kind of a mistake. You have to have a follow-up conversation. You have to figure out what broke down in the system, or maybe you don't have a system. Now you need to create one. And that, because what happens is then it becomes a pattern, and it's that definition of insanity, right? You keep doing the same thing. You keep having the same argument or the same miscommunication or the same issue, but you don't try to change it. You don't try to fix it. It's the same issue. You don't change it. So so this is incorporating the communication piece. If you have a miscommunication or lack of communication that leads to an issue, you are responsible for improving the communication. And this never stops. You can be 25, you can be 85. If you have a partner, if you have someone that you are in a relationship with, you are going to have to communicate. You're going to have to sit down and say, hey, this didn't work the way we did that. Obviously, we weren't on the same page, or we missed something. What are we going to do differently? And if you do that, if you make an effort to sit down when everyone has calmed down and to really talk about how to do it better next time, you'll have much more success in communication. And this applies to your kids. If you have an argument or a miscommunication with your kid, whether you're talking about an expectation around the house, or if you have a kid that's driving and they didn't come home on time, you have an obligation as a member of this relationship to sit down and say, hey, what are we going to do differently next time so that this doesn't keep happening? I think that having conversations about expectations kind of is involved in this. It can be a part of this, because I think a lot of the times what leads to miscommunication is not clearly telling each other, hey, this is my expectation of you, or this is my expectation of myself. For example, our kid has this class after school or this after school activity, and it's a different day than it usually is. Who's going to pick them up? Well, I have to take this other kid to do this. Where are you going to be? And because a lot of the times what will happen is, well, I have a meeting today. You didn't tell me that I had to go do this. You just expected me to do it, or something like this. It's honestly, I'm telling you, most of the arguments that make up our the relationships that people are in are little things that have to do with not clearly communicating. Because I think a lot of the times when people think about relationships and miscommunication, they think of fights. Like, we fight, we yell, we argue, and that is a part of it, but really I don't think it's as big of a part as the little daily miscommunications, because they thought they said something that they didn't say, or they didn't say it as clearly. And a lot of the times I think we assume that other people think the way we think. So if I'm telling you that I want to do something, or I want to go somewhere, but I'm not being clear, I'm saying, oh, well, it would be really nice if we could do this. Okay, well, I'm not saying I want to do this. I'm saying it'd be nice. Well, I'm not being very clear. So my husband or whoever it is I'm talking to might be like, yeah, that would be really cool. Okay, no, I'm actually saying let's go do it right now. Well, if I'm expecting them to pick up on what I'm saying and I'm not being really clear, then I'm going to start getting frustrated, and then that other person has absolutely no idea why I'm frustrated, because they thought we already had plans to do something else or whatever. I'm just kind of making this up as I go. But all this to say that it's so easy to get caught up in me or, anyone thinking like the other person is on the same wavelength as I am. If I'm thinking that, if I'm processing my thought a certain way and I assume the other person is thinking of it the same way, then sure, I'm going to expect that we're going to be in the same boat. But if the other person actually thinks differently than I do, then that's going to be a problem. And so you can apply that to any example. If you're trying to decide what you want to eat and you don't know what you want, you're waiting for the other person to make a decision, but you're not telling the other person you want them to make a decision. You're saying, I don't know what I want. And they're like, well, I don't know what I want. Isn't that one of the most common arguments that people have, couples, right, is deciding where to eat. But it's the same, if I said, hey, I really don't know how to make a decision right now. I'm okay with you picking whatever you want. I'm not going to say no to it. Then the other person can pick it without any issues. But if I'm like, oh, I don't know what I want, and then I stop it there, then if they don't know what they want, I don't know what I want, then we're stuck, right? Simple example, but it's such a common thing. Like, be clear. Say, hey, I really don't want that place. I'd really like to pick something different. Otherwise, you end up going somewhere you don't want to go, being bitter about it, getting irritated when the service isn't good or whatever, and then it turns into like, now we're just irritated with each other. So be clear. Hey, no, I don't really want to do that today. Or, I don't want to hang out with these people, or I don't want to do this. I don't want our kid to do this activity. Because when you don't clearly speak your mind and you let the other person kind of make a decision, if you're not happy with that decision, but you just go with it to avoid conflict or to avoid an argument, it will always end up in an argument anyway. It will end up in a conflict, whether it's external and you argue out loud, or you just on the inside feel upset and build resentment towards that person. So you're better off being clear, telling the other person how you feel. If the way that you feel is something that they are upset by or that bothers them, then you need to have a conversation about it. You don't just get to say, well, I don't want to tell them how I feel because they're going to get upset, so I'm just going to keep it in. And now, down the road, it'll come up and there will be an argument or a fight. You cannot do that. If you do that, then you are the problem. You are the one that's not clearly communicating, that's leaving important information out that could have led to a different outcome. Now, if you speaking your mind and your opinions, obviously with respect, but if you saying how you feel to your partner leads to conflict all the time or leads them to being angry or yelling, then that's a different issue. You guys are going to have to figure out why this dynamic exists. Are you just really bad at the way you express your opinion and you're not very respectful? Or is the other person needing to work on their mood? Maybe they're impatient. Maybe they have an anger issue. So if your reason for not communicating clearly is fear or avoidance of a reaction, you need to address that, or else you'll be in a relationship or in a situation that is not open and comfortable, not safe, and eventually will lead to a breakdown one way or another, whether it's internal unhappiness or external break in the relationship. So figure out if the struggles in your communication are because you guys just need to learn how to speak more clearly, or you need to have conversations about how to do things differently in the way you organize your day and your family, or is it because you don't want to speak clearly because you're afraid of a reaction? So regardless, those breakdowns, the missing pieces in your communication, whatever is missing, is most likely the majority of the miscommunication, the problems that you face in communication. It's the little things. So I want you to think about, what could you be doing differently? How do you need to communicate differently? How do you need to listen differently? Because that rotates, right? Those roles constantly rotate. Sometimes you're the speaker, sometimes you're the listener. And there are some people who are great at listening, but they're really, really bad at expressing themselves clearly. And vice versa. Some people are really, really good at talking and saying how they feel clearly, but they don't listen. They're, a lot of people get stuck in this, in a situation where, especially if it's, a touchy issue, where when the other person is speaking, all you're doing is just waiting for your turn to talk. You're not actually listening. You're waiting for them to stop so that you can make your point or you can make your argument back. And that it's human nature, and we want to defend ourselves. But if you are not slowing down and listening and really trying to respect what the other person is saying, then you're going to miss what they're saying. You're not going to get the point, and that could lead to more misunderstanding, more conflict, more argument. So if you and your spouse are equally and actively working on speaking clearly and listening with patience and with, understanding, then you eliminate so many arguments. You eliminate so much misunderstanding and miscommunication because you're doing both parts to the best of your ability. And the reality is, I don't think this is something that everyone does well in. All of us. No one is great at it 100% of the time. It's not possible. Even the best, relationships, best couples mess this up at some point. Then there's some people who mess this up a lot, and more often than not they're defensive, or they don't speak clearly, or they don't listen well. So you just need to figure out, are you needing to just tweak this and improve it a little bit in your relationship, or are you needing a major overhaul and you guys really need to change the way you communicate? So think about this, talk to your significant other about this. Let this be something that you both are working on, because it definitely takes two to incorporate any communication. But in this specifically, you are going to be the listener and the speaker inevitably. So make sure you're working on both parts, but make sure you're doing it with your significant other. Okay? So I'm going to wrap up here. I hope you have a great rest of your day and your week, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.